In the dimly lit valleys of Victorian London, a dark and menacing figure lurked in the shadows, forever etching his name into the history of horror. It was autumn of 1888 when the Whitechapel district became the stage for a series of brutal murders that would capture the morbid fascination of the world. This is the story of Jack the Ripper. The story began with whispers and rumors spreading like wildfire through the cobbled streets. The assailant, cloaked with anonymity, struck with ruthless precision and vanished without a trace. Mary Ann Nichols, known familiarly as Polly, was a destitute woman who had fallen on hard times. It was the early hours of August 31st when Polly, seeking shelter from relentless downpour, found herself wandering the eerie corners of Buck's Row. Unbeknownst to her, a malevolent presence was waiting to attack. With swift and merciless skill, the Ripper pounced on Polly. In the stillness of night, her desperate cries for survival were drowned away by the pattering of the rain. His blade swam through the air, finding its target in Polly's fragile form. He left the aftermath of his deranged mind laying in the street, not to be found until the next morning. News of Polly's murder spread like a game of telephone, plunging the city into communal terror. The hunt for the elusive killer had begun. Scotland Yard, the renowned British task force, took charge of the investigation, with the determination of solving the mystery. Led by Inspector Frederick Alberline, the clock for the race against time ticked by. The crime scene was meticulously examined, and witnesses were questioned in an attempt to gain any useful information regarding Polly's death. However, the Victorian era offered little technology as far as forensic techniques, and the Ripper's swiftness and lack of evidence left behind posed significant challenges. As the investigation progressed, detectives were confronted with a multitude of theories, hoaxes, and of course, false leads. The frenzy surrounding the case only made things more difficult, with public scrutiny arriving in abundance against Scotland Yard. The only thing that they can conclude from the crime scene was that the nature of the slashes were so precise that whoever did it had either surgical or butchering experience. Despite the intense efforts of Aberline and his colleagues, the mass murderer continued to take victims without a trace. Annie Chapman was a middle-aged prostitute whose life ended tragically in the early hours of September 8th. She was known for her struggles with alcoholism and homelessness, leaving her completely vulnerable to the dangers that were on the prowl in Whitechapel. Her body was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, a notorious slum area. The sight that met investigators was harrowing. Her throat had been savagely slashed, nearly detaching her head from her body. Investigators knew this had to be the same man from when they gazed upon Annie's abdomen. The killer had shown significant anatomical knowledge as he essentially dissected his victim. Several of her organs were missing, with the others remaining ruthlessly exposed and shamed. The state of utter carnage perplexed Scotland Yard as they realized that this person had to have extensive knowledge of the inner workings of the human body. As the public attempted to grapple with yet another senseless killing in their community, they struggled to find a hopeful light to turn to. The quest to unmask the killer would continue, leading to more unanswered questions and failed leads. There was barely any time to recover before another body was discovered on September 30th. Elizabeth Stride was a Swedish-born prostitute trying to make a living in the heart of Victorian London, familiar with all the hardships and dangers that came with her chosen path. Little did she know that those dangers would prove to be irreversible as she stood in Dutfield's yard. The echoes of the city's hustle and bustle had faded to silence, and a shiver ran down her spine as she felt that something was amiss. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the murky depths, shrouded in the veil of night. Before she could react, a blade glinted in the moonlight and found its mark on her throat. The searing pain, the feeling of lifeblood draining away, consumed her with horror. In those fleeting moments, she glimpsed the face of her attacker. His intentions, however, were disrupted, leaving her body spared from the extent of mutilation that the victims before had suffered. As she had succumbed to the cold embrace of death, her name was added to the list of souls taken by brutality and sadistic desire. The killer, unsatisfied with his interruption, decided that the life of Elizabeth Stride wasn't enough to satisfy him. That same night, he also took the life of Catherine Eddowes, another unassuming prostitute whose life was taken under the ethereal glow of the moon. The name Jack the Ripper was the moniker given to these mass killings due to a haunting letter that was sent to the Central News Agency after Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes' slain bodies were discovered. The letter, taunting the authorities and fueling further public terror, finally gave a name, although fake, to the unknown face. Reacting swiftly, Scotland Yard meticulously analyzed the contents of the letter. They spent hours poring over the language and handwriting, hoping there was something, anything that could give them a lead. They tirelessly scrutinized details, but still had to grapple with the fact that this letter could be a fake. When the letter yielded no results, the only thing that Scotland Yard could think to do was to keep the public informed and increase police presence in rough areas. Since the Ripper had only killed either homeless women or prostitutes up to this point, but those methods would prove to fail in November of 1888. Mary Jane Kelly, a young woman with a haunting past, found herself caught in the clutches of the Ripper. On the early morning of November 9th, the true extent of the Ripper's savagery was revealed to Scotland Yard within the confines of Mary's room on Dorset Street. What greeted their eyes was a scene of unparalleled horror. Mary's body has been brutally mutilated, her face almost unrecognizable to investigators. The barbarity of the scene had made it clear that the Ripper had reached the climax of his masochism. Limbs were severed and organs were shattered, leaving Scotland Yard with the full knowledge that this man was the worst sadist they had ever seen. With this new murder, a new wave of terror even reached inside the investigative offices of Scotland Yard. Everyone that worked on the task force went home at night, haunted with the scene of Mary's body, with the realization that nothing could stop this vicious killer. The lack of modern forensic techniques, the challenges posed by the densely populated and impoverished area, and the Ripper's sheer skill kept the detectives completely in the dark. As time passed, the trail grew cold. The Ripper had escaped their grasp once again. Investigators lay in wait for another case to pop up, with anxiety growing during each passing hour. But that day never came. Another body was never discovered, and the vicious killings seemed to abruptly stop. But why? Some believe that he must have died himself, falling victim to the demise of his own hellish urges. Others believe that he simply moved somewhere else as police presence and public attention increased. Attempts to look for similar murders in other locations yielded no results, leaving the murderer a ghost in the night. Jack the Ripper seemed to vanish into the shadows, leaving behind a legacy of fear and unsolved mysteries. In the coming years, countless suspects would be named, examined, and even arrested. Investigators started with those who had discovered the bodies initially, including one that was a butcher, but they had little resources for physically linking anyone to the crimes. As decades passed by, the case of Jack the Ripper turned into a historical enigma, fueled by speculation, conspiracy theories, and countless works of fiction. To this day, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains unsolved. While the streets of Whitechapel may finally have relief from the brutality of one of the most horrific serial murders in history, his haunting legacy still lives on today. His ability to evade capture and his signature style of mutilation continue to fuel the imagination of true crime enthusiasts, historians, and amateur sleuths everywhere.